Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today with Beyond the Content Filter. We're going to get started momentarily. We're going to give a few moments for people to, get in and get connected, and then we will get started. So, just momentarily, we'll begin. We're just going to wait for folks. We see all sorts of attendees now rolling in, so we'll get started here momentarily with today's webinar, Manage Methods.
All right, David, I think we're ready to go.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great day to be doing a webinar. I'm excited. I'm coming to you live from the California IT and Education Conference happening this week live here in Sacramento, California. It's really good to be back out and seeing educators and education technology leaders. And I'm really excited to be presenting today here with our friends, Andy and Mike, and I'll be introducing them momentarily. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Waugh. I'll be your host. We are Managed Methods, and we are presenting today on our continuing series of events and webinars and thought leadership beyond the content filter, how to identify and close your district's cybersecurity and safety gaps for the upcoming year of 2022 and beyond. So we'll go ahead and get started, and let's cover a few housekeeping items first. Katie, if you want to jump the slides forward there. Just as a quick reminder, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and so we will be providing a copy of this once the process completes after the session today. It usually takes about 24 hours. And so everyone that's registered and in attendance today, you will receive a recorded copy of today's webinar. Any questions you may have, please submit them in the chat panel here through the Zoom meeting, and we will get to those towards the end. And also as a reminder, all attendees are muted, so feel free to ask your questions in the chat panel for today's event. So we're really excited. Have a good number of folks join us. Thank you so much. Whether it's good morning if you're here on the West Coast where I am today, whether it's good afternoon because you're out on the East Coast, or wherever you may be throughout the globe, thank you so much for joining us. Well, today we're going to have a really good panel discussion. Again, really excited to have my two guests here, our friends Mike and Andy, and I'll be introducing them momentarily. Again, my name is David Waugh, and we are Managed Methods. And let me kind of give you a little primer of what we're going to discuss today. So go ahead and let's bring the slides forward. So first and foremost, here's going to be the agenda that we're going to cover for the next period of time. I'm going to give a little bit of an intro on our perspective here at Managed Methods. And for example, I've been presenting this topic here for 2 days. I have had 2 sessions here at this conference. And we're going to talk about why schools need to look at cybersecurity and some of the gaps that are out there. And then we're going to talk about this report that we've recently published. And then we're going to get to our panel discussion with our guest, Andy and Mike. And then we'll take your questions as we get to the end. So let's go ahead and bring this forward. So I'll ask a question to the audience as you look at these things, and you can see this. And everybody, please chime in and feel free to put it in the chat. But as we look at this, the question that's out there is a lot of folks are asking, why do we need to have more security or cloud security, cybersecurity, et cetera, within our schools? Well, to help answer this question, Managed Methods recently commissioned a survey with EdWeek and the EdWeek Research Center to learn more about how school districts are using cloud applications and what they are doing to secure the sensitive data and information that's shared within those cloud applications. Cloud applications such as Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, Meet, etc. In this survey, over 200 district level administrators responded to the survey, 54 technology department leaders, 52 superintendents, 30 curriculum and instructor technologists, and many more participated in the survey, again, from EdWeek Research Center. And the analysis of the survey responses uncovered some fundamental and I think concerning gaps in understanding really what is cloud security, what does it mean to individual schools and school leaderships, and why, importantly, do schools need it? So today, when we get into our panel discussion, we'll talk a little bit more about how it's different from your traditional security, such as firewalls, network perimeter, content filters, web filters. And then we'll kind of challenge some of the stubborn beliefs that the service provider is responsible for securing the data in those apps. So let's look at some of the findings and go ahead and bounce forward a little bit here. So Katie, let's move on. So in this report, we saw that there was we asked a series of questions to our respondents, and we looked at some of the different things that people consider. And so when we stop and look at how schools are in the cloud, how they're adopting the cloud, and you can see from the graphics here, 94% of the district ed tech decision makers and their influences reported that they have moved at least some portion of their IT systems into cloud-based environments. Now, obviously, two of the big leading cloud-based environments that you all use in your environments today are those environments from Google and Microsoft. And there's other environments as well. But for all intents and purposes of today's conversation, that's really going to be an area that we're going to focus in on. The reality is that a lot of districts have moved critical business operations and information into the cloud, but they have them in all sorts of disparate systems, whether it's human resource systems, financial systems, student information systems, you name it. Google and Microsoft are far from the only cloud apps that are out there, but they're arguably some of the most heavily used for communication and collaboration between districts, students, parents, family members, etc. So it's important that we kind of preface and talk about all these different types of applications and where they fit into it. So, but are leaders in school districts taking it as seriously as they should? Is there enough being done right now, and is there more that can be done? And so, as you can see from the survey and some of the respondents, while leaders seem to have a healthy understanding and concern about student safety risks in the school provided technology, their concerns kind of drop off rather quickly when it comes to dealing with data security. And a shocking number of survey respondents were not overly concerned about harmful cybersecurity risks that they might be facing. So, this is an area that we'll talk with our panelists about as we move forward. And again, you can learn about this when you read the report itself. So Katie, let's go over and jump to our next slide. So when we look at some of the other findings that are out there, are you confident enough? And as you can see across the board, we see that 50% don't have any kind of, monitoring for external domain file sharing. When we talked about file sharing in the questions that were being asked, what you don't know can hurt you. You can see some of the statistics here, but 60% of the survey respondents are at least quite confident in their privacy and the security of the data that's being stored. But as you see, a lot more are not. The survey showed that, as I just pointed out, 50% were not able to or didn't feel that they could continuously scan files being shared or things happening outside of their environment. 43%, said they don't know if their cloud platform can continuously help them scan these things or look for it. 40% said, well, we're just not sure who has access to these things. And so on. The stories, we hear countless times, and even here over the past 2 days, as I've been presenting at this conference here in California, these same type of startling statistics kind of keep jumping up and the conversations keep happening. And it's because schools have lots of different technology in play, and they have lots of different layers that they need to address. And so multi-layered approaches, being able to have the visibility into tools, into the Google Workspace, into the Microsoft. It's not just about what's happening on the device. And it's not just about what's happening at the network ledge. And I think that a lot of these things came to light in the past few years. And we'll talk about that with our panel as we move forward. So let's look at some of the startling statistics that are also out there. So, Katie, let's go ahead and move forward to our next slide. So in this graphic, if you look, it's no secret that schools are now a point of emphasis for cybersecurity and a target for the threat landscape and cyber actors out there, cyber criminal actors. The school districts have moved into the top 5 most targeted and are showing serious weaknesses in terms of their cybersecurity landscape. And these gaps, these security gaps, lead to some real consequences. This statistic here is published by our friends at the K-12 Cybersecurity Resource Center. And since 2016, there has been nearly 1,200 publicly disclosed incidents involving schools in our communities. Just over the jump from 2019 to 2020, and we all know that that's when the pandemic began in 2020, there was nearly a 20% increase, 17%, according to this study, in terms of publicly disclosed incidents and cyber attacks. 36% of the incidents that occurred last year in 2020 resulted in some form of student and or staff data breach or leak. This is startling. It's concerning, it's alarming, and it's why we're having these conversations, is because K-12 has become a leading target. And we're gonna talk a little bit more as we jump into those things. So to kind of demonstrate this, Katie, let's show them where we are. So, as we look at the media these days, no matter what you're looking at, whether it's your online newspaper, whether it's the traditional newspaper, whether you get it delivered on your phone or you're watching the nightly news, wherever it may be, cyber incidents are all over the media. Most of the time, though, the cyber incidents you see in the media are more about the glamorous things that are happening, and cyber attacks on big business and cyber attacks in our transportation system or our governments. But all too often, these headlines that are involving our community, the K-12, the education community, tend to kind of get buried in the local news stories, and they're maybe not as prevalent out there, but they're out there. And in fact, just these incidents that we're showing here on the screen were ripped from the headlines this past summer in the past 6 months. It's startling, the number of incidents that are happening. And I think that's why so many of you are joining today's topic, this conversation today. So let's go ahead and jump forward here and talk about, what are the things in a multi-layered approach, and what are some of the things we're going to talk about or hear about today from our panelists, and what are the things that were covered when talking to some of the survey respondents in this Ed Week report that was commissioned. So when you look at maybe a traditional cybersecurity stack within the school districts out there, and Andy and Michael talk about this as well, schools need to have multiple layers, because you have multiple layers in which the communication and the technologies all work together. So you need to have a multi-layered approach to address the cybersecurity and safety and compliance needs. You have, of course, your systems that have been around really since technology came into schools. The bottom layers here, the infrastructure, the network layers. But then in the past, probably 5 years or more, these top 3 layers have really started to come into play. And arguably the top layer, the cloud layer, is the newest layer, hence why we have it kind of here at the top of this stack. What we want to make sure everyone understands, and why we emphasize this, we're not saying that any one of these layers is any more important than the other layer. We're not saying that they go in any one particular order. We're saying that you need to make sure you address each one of these layers and have a multi-layered approach. Too many times, even just yesterday in the conference here when I presented, I had a district leader come up to me with their IT director, and they thanked me for my presentation, and they said, hey, we appreciate your presentation, because up to this point, we have a firewall from a leading brand vendor. We have a web filter on our devices, and we thought we had enough. We thought we had it covered. But you've pointed out some other areas that we need to address. And that's, I think, what Andy and Mike will share today, is that you have to have this multi-layered approach. And the survey respondents show that I think many districts are still missing, some of these multi-layered aspects of that. So, we'll dive into some of those things. And that, again, is what Ed Week Research Center, reached out to these 200 plus districts, and the survey response kind of showed some of these areas maybe of weakness. So I'd like to get right into the meat and potatoes now, and introduce my friends over here, Mike and Andy, and we appreciate you gentlemen joining us today. So I have with us today Mr. Mike Leesburg. He's the Executive Director of Information Technology from Richland School District in Richland, Washington. And I also have with us Mr. Andy Lombardo from Marysville City School District in Marysville, Tennessee. Andy's the Director of Technology there. With that said, I'm going to work my way back. Andy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your district out there in Tennessee?
Sure. We're a relatively small school district of about almost 6,000 students now in the foothills of the Smokies here in East Tennessee. We're in the 8th year of a one-to-one initiative. And so we have been sending devices home since well before the pandemic. And, we've been working through that tech stack. So cloud security is definitely a vital part of this.
Thank you. Mike, how about you tell us a little bit about your district in Richland?
Yeah, thank you, David. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending. My name is Mike Leesburg. As David said, I'm the Executive Director of Richland School District over here in Richland, Washington. We have about 13,500 students. We've got 11 elementary schools, 4 middle schools, 2 comprehensive high schools, 2 alternative high schools, which includes 1 homeschool program, and then 1 virtual academy completely online, which we stood up at the start of last school year in response to COVID. We are a hybrid school district. We have both Windows environments and Chrome, Google environments. We are also one-to-one take-home in grades 6 through 12 and have been for about 4 or 5 years now. We are one-to-one with Chromebook carts in classrooms in grades K through 12. So when the pandemic hit, we were ready to go with one-to-one across our entire district, albeit at home and remote versus on site, but we were prepared for that. And as David said, there's a big landscape here playing in both fields, having Windows on the business side and then Chrome on the student teacher side. We play in both sandboxes, so to speak. So yeah, we have a little bit more of a threat coming from both sides of that versus being all Google or either all Microsoft. So we have to address both sides of the coin there in our district.
Well, Mike, thank you. And Andy, Mike, obviously this is going to be fun. There's going to be a lot of questions that I think you guys can kind of cover the landscape. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about the survey. And you both read it. We both talked through it, had some conversations about it. So one of the many questions that was asked, the survey found, unsurprisingly, that over 90% of districts have moved into the cloud, and a lot of them moved this past year, but only 50% of the respondents said that they are using a platform or a tool to protect their data in Google and Microsoft 365. Does that surprise you? And do you think that there are gaps out there that these folks might be missing?
I think one of the other statistics you pointed out earlier about the publicly disclosed data breaches, the 1,180 publicly disclosed, that publicly disclosed jumps out to me that, that's just what people, one, know about, and two, have reported. And so, in the education industry, I think in general, we're a little bit farther behind some other larger industries when it comes to detection and the importance of detection. So I think there are a lot of cases where, those breaches or compromises aren't even, one, not reported, but also not known. So, there's that danger of, you don't know what you don't know. And so that's one of the parts that's not surprising, is that, the visibility and lack of visibility a lot of times stands in the way of being able to make those, one, know what to be concerned about, but then two, work to improve those areas.
Yeah, those are great points, Andy. I would also add too, there was a couple of slides back, David, that you showed all the different environments that we have to be concerned with regard to collaborative tools and communications. Both of those come into big play here. So it's not just, moves beyond the files and documents themselves, but those other communication channels that come into play. So whether they're chatting within Google Classroom, whether they're chatting within their LMS, or they're chatting within your email or your district supported chat environment, whatever that might be. We use Teams. We also have Canvas as our LMS. Students are chatting within there. Also within written documentation that is stored in multiple storage locations, from Google Drive to OneDrive to network storage to even C drive. So it's everywhere, and it's incumbent of us to make sure that we understand where that data is and what those communication channels are being used, so that we can put those effective security measures in place to help those when we need those things to stand up and alert us that, hey, we have an issue in this particular area that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think another part too of that is that, I think it's been alluded to that this is a relatively newer area. And I think that a lot of times when infrastructure went off-prem and into the cloud, a lot of those sales pitches were about, the convenience of not having to manage your own servers and the convenience of not being responsible for this and responsible for upkeep and everything. And I think one of the things that gets glossed over is that, when you go to the cloud and you're in that shared responsibility model, you're still responsible for your data. So you may not physically have the server on site, but it's still your data and you're still ultimately responsible.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%, Andy. I think that's one of the things that does get easily forgotten about, is because you're working with a third-party vendor, a lot of people assume that the responsibility is now shifted over to their shoulders, and that could be further from the truth there. It's still on your shoulders, and you still need to be responsible for what happens, and know and understand what they're using your data for at the same time.
Both excellent, both of you, excellent comments and points. And, and I think one of the things that all too often, like I shared, and Andy, you made a good point about, the shared responsibility model is, again, I mentioned earlier, I had some people come up to me after one of my presentations I gave here at this conference in California, where they talked to me about the tools they had in place, but yet they now realize they have some gaps because many times district leaders and especially, and sometimes at, maybe the administration layer where you have to go to get approval for things, they might say, well, we invested in this, next generation firewall, correct? And we invested in this, web filter at the device layer. Those things are good technologies. My point of that previous slide I put up, and thanks for referencing that, was not to say that those technologies are not important and not needed. They absolutely are. It's just realizing that the landscape has changed. And I think what we all learned over the past 18, 24 months is that those gaps were always there, and that network security, edge security, device security are definitely needed. And we're glad we had those in place when the pandemic hit, but they alone are not enough. And once things moved out of those traditional security perimeters, I think everybody started to see that, oh, wow, we need to have greater visibility. And it's also a case too that many times, and you talked about it as well with the shared data responsibility model. A lot of these cloud providers, Google, Microsoft, their technologies are outstanding, and your data is certainly very, very safe in their environments. But they're not going to manage the interaction between your users, staff, students. They're not monitoring that. That's your responsibility. It's your responsibility to have policies and rules in place on that. So that's a good point. Let's jump to another one of the takeaways that we found to be very interesting. It was that 79% of ed tech leaders, your peers out there, and influencers were somewhat to very concerned, kind of that broad range, somewhat concerned to very concerned about ransomware, malware, phishing, compared to 64% who are somewhat to very concerned about data breaches and leaks. So these are high statistics out there. So, but according to a friend of ours, Doug Levin at the K-12-6 and the K-12 cyber incident tracking, they were, just over twice as many, there were just over twice as many data breaches and leak incidents in 2020 as there were to ransomware and phishing. So when we compare these two stats where, one group, almost 80% was concerned about, what I call the outside attacks coming to the district, malware, phishing, ransomware. And then it drops almost 20 points in terms of concern when people are concerned about data breaches and data leaks. And so do you think that there's a gap in the concern versus the real world events? Is there only a one track mind and that people are more concerned about, ransomware and people are trying to attack us? And yet the statistics show that a lot of what happens to these school districts is a data leak or a data breach.
Right.
And, breach meaning somebody's attacked and taken the data, or it's kind of gotten out, or leak, whereas the users either intentionally or accidentally leak that information out. So what's you guys' take on this one?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there, David. When you showed the statistic earlier about publicly disclosed ransomware attacks, one could argue very easily that number is significantly low because, as Andy mentioned, those are the ones that have publicly let people know that had happened. Many times those people do not know about that, and school districts don't release that information publicly because they do not want to be in the headlines and do not want to advertise that out there, which could theoretically, think about it, bring more people toward them and start looking at them even further. So I think those numbers are really, really low. And I think that if school districts are kind of not paying attention to those figures and those situations and security needs in their district, I think it's going to be a matter of time before that comes back to haunt them. For example, I've been doing vulnerability and pen testing for approximately 8 years now. And when I initially started it, I was doing it about once every 4 years, 3-4 years. I've now narrowed that down within the past 3-4 years to doing it every other year. And now I'm going to be doing it annually because I do not want my name in the newspaper. I do not want my district called out, and I don't want to be standing in front of local news people on the 11 o'clock news either. I don't want to find myself in that place. So I want to choose to be proactive here and make sure that we have everything in place that we can possibly think of. And we're not going to be able to think of everything. So those other resources that you shared on that same slide where we have CISA and ISAC now stepping up as far as helping the K-12 sector significantly now, providing a lot of resources that we can use to help determine where we are internally without having to spend a lot of money on it. They're providing those resources to help us. So help and assistance is there. It's up to us to make sure that we reach out and leverage what is available to us.
And Mike makes a great point about not wanting to stand in front of the news. And I think that, that psychology and everything plays a little bit of a part there with, the fact that just disasters naturally draw attention. And couple that with, I think that people maybe are a little desensitized to data breaches and they don't seem like that much of an assault. Maybe the motives aren't as clear. Like obviously the ransomware, they can see, there's been this attack and they are intending to get this many millions of dollars out of it. That makes the headline. The bigger the ransom, the bigger the headline. And so people can kind of see the motivation there. And I think that sometimes when it comes to a data breach, people don't value themselves as a target. And so it's not really concrete and able to see, okay, I am a target, I'm valuable, an attacker could get this out of my data and out of me. And so it really kind of desensitizes them to thinking of themselves in that kind of threat model.
Yeah, I would also add one more thing there. If you would take a look at your daily scans your firewall's getting, I think if you haven't paid attention to that, or at least looked at that information yet, you're going to be alarmed at what you're already seeing on a daily basis. I know we are, and we're constantly being scanned. It's up into the thousands, 10,000 times a day in our district for multiple different resources using multiple different methods and domains looking at us and just seeing what's there, what they can see, what's available, and what might be available.
Yeah, and applying that back to kind of the cloud environment too, I think that one of the things that my users have seen over the past couple of years is how targeted campaigns are against us, and seeing, we've been able to monitor pretty closely and see, notice when we make changes to the website with staffing, and within a certain amount of time, we can start to see those people start being included on lists, and see those target lists where they'll send maybe a phishing campaign to everybody at a school except for the principal and the technology staff. And so it's not necessarily just a bot scraping the website, but people are spending time investing and making intentional targeted attacks.
Yeah, and they're relying on our ignorance, which historically we haven't been that hasn't been a thing at the forefront for us. Security has not been an issue in K-12 historically until recently, within the past 5 years or so, and it needs to be. It needs to be at the very top of all of our lists today, without question in my mind.
Well, and I think you both make outstanding points on that, and I think one of the things I want to clarify with that question, and I know that the report was meaning to just look at both areas, is that, as we talked about, what you don't know can hurt you. And,
Yes.
Mike, you talked about the number of things you're being scanned, and Andy, I know we've talked about this, but, ransomware, phishing attacks, malware, all of it is bad. And, arguably, ransomware incidents are, far more work to recover from than maybe some of the other types of incidents, but they're all bad. And then, the data loss through accidental, many a times that's one of the things that really comes back to bite us, is that people don't realize that if they don't have that visibility, they don't know how much data is being shared. And the problem is, in our education norms, our culture is that of sharing. We want to share the information. We want to make it available. And the problem is, laws and regulations and compliance rules at a federal and state level are constantly evolving, especially at the state level. And many times then these data breaches or data leaks were as a result of an accidental share type of situation. And so there's a lot of those. That's why I wanted to clarify some of those things. They're both important. Which leads to then this next piece where, one of the things that I know, I see it all the time, as I'm presenting here at the Site Conference, California, over the past, 3-4 months, I've been presenting it at conferences all around the country. We talked about it, and the survey touched on it, is the lack of the general understanding around cloud application layer security versus that of maybe traditional legacy cybersecurity approaches around, say, the network and the perimeter, like your firewall. Again, as I talked about, and I'll continually say, these are all very good technologies and all needed in that multi-layered cybersecurity approach. How would you gentlemen maybe describe the main differences to the audience for those that are maybe not aware of it, and where you have these different tools and why they fit in these different places?
Yeah, I think that kind of alluded this a little bit, but the way that kind of shift has happened from infrastructure being on-prem and under our control, there's really been a paradigm shift. And now, whereas historically it'd be easier to lock something down, easier to configure something, easier to set something so that someone doesn't have access. Part of that philosophy of being able to share and share seamlessly internally and externally is what's given that big attack surface for our users, because they're given the tools to decide, their own sharing level and whether something is public or if it's restricted or if it's available to anonymous users, whatever those sharing levels are. And I don't think there was ever any kind of, while there's a paradigm shift in how the technology works, there wasn't a paradigm shift in how anyone really understood what that meant. So that transition from, the on-prem file server to an online share drive, I don't think there's really been a mental cultural shift into people thinking about having to protect that for themselves instead of it being protected by the IT staff. And so some of those tools, like managed methods, that help IT staffs get a foothold in those areas and have that more visibility into what the landscape looks like, what's being shared, who's sharing it, how widely is it being shared. That's kind of an area that, until recently wasn't on my radar, until the past 2 or 3 years. It wasn't really something that kept me awake at night. But the first time someone accidentally shares something very sensitive with all users, it's very quickly on your radar.
Yeah, I would agree with all that, Andy. Those are great points. And I would also point out that you mentioned managed methods, and I will as well. That's one of the things that drew us to David and the product was the fact that they had, you had mentioned earlier, David, about web filters and content filters, and those are all great and everybody has those. But like we mentioned, like we're talking about, they only cover certain specific areas. So if you look at things in kind of like a Venn diagram model, you'll have everybody has their own little circle, but then there's these overlapping circles where they might share data or something, or one of those pieces might not address the other component that's needed in that area. And that's where managed methods really stepped in to help us. For example, there were 3 really big things that stood out to us that we were lacking in, that we hadn't been addressing. To the point was the fact that one of them was the fact that in our hybrid environment, we didn't really have an insight into the Google Drive and OneDrive directly, into the documents in those drive storage areas. We didn't have that access. Now we do have that access. The other component of it was through email, not necessarily the phishing and spam component of it, but the cell components, the wording, the what's being typed into the words, and those are being shared in emails that can trigger alerts. Those can also have an impact, but again, you may not think about that. And then the third part of it was the applications and extensions. Often, as we know, teachers like to use everything that they can find, all the latest, greatest tools and tricks, and apps, and download an extension and so on. Well, for the most part, we have operated in we block all, allow when needed. But that's very hard to manage of a district it tends to get fairly large very quickly. And so then you kind of go the other way. Do we open it all up and then only block those that are going to cause us problems? But that's kind of like open the barn door, and then all of a sudden you got everything flooding in. I remember I had an eye opener about 3 years ago. We didn't really have a full vetting process about what software was being allowed on our networks. And we brought a product in and put it in play in a demo mode. And all of a sudden we looked at a report, and there were close to 1,000 applications that were on our network in our district that weren't approved, that we don't even know about. And what's being shared there? What access do they have? What have they been given? And that comes back to what I was mentioning earlier about the applications and extensions within managed methods is, typically those will be click to approve. Well, there's a lot of fine print and detail in that teachers typically don't pay attention to and really shouldn't have to, right? But there are disclaimers that they may not know what that it really includes, what they're clicking yes to and what they're going to allow access to. And the same thing with students. So those 3 things, managed methods now allows us to have that visibility that we didn't have before with just content filter and firewalls and a couple of other security things we had in place.
Well, and I think that's a perfect segue to this next kind of data point that was found in the survey, was that some of the promising results we saw there was that a sizable majority of districts are using and have upgraded their technology stacks. Surprisingly, we saw that a large number have upgraded to some of the enhanced licensing with Google Workspace and Microsoft 365 versus just the free components. About 24% of the respondents indicated, though, they were using some form of third-party cloud security platform versus the upgraded or in addition to the upgraded solutions. And as Managed Methods customers, you both, shared, we would fall into that category. And so thank you for sharing some of those benefits. Are there other benefits, you've seen by bringing in a technology like ours and some others that you want to allude to and add on to?
I think one other component that that should be in the security discussion is cell. It's very lively discussion today across the country. It is in our district, and I'm sure it's in many other districts. COVID really highlighted that to us, the social and emotional needs of our kids and what that did when they were at home and not having that collaboration and be able to hang out with their friends and so on. And we're now still seeing the toll that's taken on them. And that's come forward big time. So I include that now in this discussion. And again, Managed Methods has this little cell component that helps alert us to those things. There are other products out there as well, but like we've been discussing here, there's not one size that's going to fit all. You have to have a blended approach and multiple platforms to address all these different vectors and communication and collaborative tools that you're using within your district, whether that be staff or students. It impacts everybody.
Yeah, and I think another benefit too is, my experience here and with other school districts, and from talking to my peers, is that one of the big obstacles in this kind of this security realm is manpower and expertise. And so one of our benefits from using tools like Managed Methods is the ability to automate some processes, automate risk and policies, and kind of set it and forget it on the front end for a lot of things. But then also when something does come up, it's very agile for being able to respond to an incident. So, even, for example, last night we had an email compromise last night. After hours, went out about 9 o'clock, and was very quickly able to hop in, and it was an email that was sent out to close to 1,000 people, and we were able to get in and using Managed Methods, find that, identify the mailboxes it was in, and delete it from mailboxes. And just to give a shout out real quick to somebody on your team, we had a technical problem with Microsoft while that was going on. And I put in a ticket with your support last night around 9, and I was on the phone with somebody within 5 minutes. So they were super helpful. And so shout out to Fred in support.
Fred gets a lot of shout outs, and so does our entire support team. They are superheroes. We appreciate that. And that's what it's about, is we're all in this together, and we're proud to be a dedicated cybersecurity and safety company for this. And, Mike, like you talked about, the SEL, the SEL, the social emotional learning aspect of it, it's taken a toll on everybody. It's not just, obviously our kiddos are our top priorities. And as a father of 2 children and in this world, that obviously is front and center. And, but I'm proud to, wear the shield on my chest of Managed Methods as I walk back into the convention center today, because things like the product we've delivered to help, and the support and the shout outs that you just shared, Andy, that's what we're all about and what it's for. And that's where I believe many vendors are here to help, and that's why I appreciate you guys sharing how these things blend together. So as we move into some of these areas, some more areas, data security, student safety, because here's what we were just talking about a little bit. This ties to that cell kind of component of the social emotional learning. Data security and student safety are huge issues today in districts, and it's in the cloud environments heavily if you're using Google Workspace, Microsoft 365. What do you recommend to other districts who may be wondering how they can even get started in identifying the visibility gaps that they have within their domains?
I think one of the things that's been alluded to a couple of times is, you don't know what you don't know, and that can hurt you. And I think that a good place to start is finding a framework or something that you can use for self-assessment. So a good example is that K-12 Cybersecurity Resource Center that you mentioned earlier. They have a self-assessment on their website that you can go, and it takes maybe 10 or 15 minutes to fill out. But what it does is it kind of points out some of those areas that if you've not been thinking about, it will say, hey, here's an area. Are you doing anything here? It gives you a chance to go through, reflect, and then at the end, you have a list of different areas you could really just throw a dart at and say, I want to improve this thing. I'm going to start with this one, and kind of go from there. And so kind of finding a framework, whether it's a self-assessment or something like the CIS benchmarks, because the CIS benchmarks has a Microsoft 365 specific, in our case, where you can nail down and you can look at whether you want to focus on authentication or storage or email or whatever kind of area, just kind of picking a framework that can guide you, because there's so much there and you don't know what you don't know. So having a guide there to be able to say, hey, have you thought about this? This is something you might want to look at.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Andy. That's a great point. And like I mentioned earlier with the self-assessments, you mentioned that as well. Both CISA and ISAC, I believe, have self-assessments that you can easily download. They're freely available for K-12. There's a whole a bunch of resources that both of those organizations are now putting out. And those are great starting points, especially if you don't really have any idea about where to get started and what help you might need. I would agree with Andy. A self-assessment is a great place to start. That'll get you going. We've also done, since we play in both worlds, in both the Google space and the Microsoft space, we've actually done a couple of audits in our Google space with a third party that comes in, and actually we've given them access to it. They've done a report for us, and they've come back to us with like a 35 page report going over our total Google environment, what our settings are, looking at how we have everything structured, how we have our organizational structure set up, everything from top to bottom. And they went through a 35 page report with us and identified possible areas of need. And then we had discussions about them, about which ones we really wanted to pick off, starting with the low hanging fruit. And then those are obviously more important first, and then start to address those over time. But those are resources, and most companies, you'll find third-party vendors that can do that for both the Microsoft side and the Google side. Those companies are readily available to help, and they are out there. Your Google reps or your Microsoft reps should be able to help you identify those third-party vendors as well.
You know, I think a major challenge really for all districts, and I think you two will agree, is there's a real shortage of time and budget for this type of cybersecurity and safety work. You know, we certainly heard more than once from IT teams and districts out there. They just simply don't have the time to deal with the issues around data security and student safety in their cloud app environments. Unfortunately, some would rather not know about the problems because they feel like they can't address it for a number of reasons. It's the old opening Pandora's box. You know, if they were to take your advice about how to identify these gaps, and you've already alluded to some of that, how would you recommend they prioritize and start improving security and visibility in, say, Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, specifically for those two environments?
Well, as far as I would recommend that you have to bring your district administrative staff in, if that starting with the superintendent and coming all the way down, if you have to, in the cabinet level discussions. That's where you're going to gain your traction. And I think that's where you really need to get your buy-in anyway, at least to get started with. And it's very easy for you to be able to pull data and make points about why it's needed, especially with everything that's out there. And what you can simply say is, this could be us, and this could be the impact that could happen to us. And I don't want to be there, and I need your help in getting there, and continue to lobby for that. I was successful, and finally, it's taken me 2 years now. I actually have a full-time person on my staff that we call a web security analyst. All he does all day long is work with schools, buildings, and counselors and administrators on making sure web content filtering is open, social emotional learning alerts are being triggered, who's getting those, what they mean. Working with parents, we have a couple of web filters in play. We're narrowing that down to one now. We have one that has a parent app where parents can do some things off-site, helping parents navigate that landscape. And so that's one person does that specifically now on my staff, because it became a full-time job every day, all day long throughout the entire school year. And so that's just one component of it as he's dealing with the schools. But then there's also, he works on the network side with my with my networking team. So between that group of people, they're basically looking at our security structure almost on a daily basis. They are looking at it on a daily basis.
Well,
Yeah,
good. Thank you. Andy,
I was just going to say those are great, and that person on your staff sounds like a great position to be able to have. That would be, I can imagine every school system could use that person. That's a great staffing idea there, and I think kind of going back to that idea too of where to start. Kind of mentioned how much there is, and that's one thing that's easy to get taunted by is security, whether it's security in big letters in general, or cloud security, or even a single platform. There are so many pieces to the puzzle, and there are so many places for configurations and mistakes and everything else that it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And so I think finding a way to prioritize and pick. I think one of our favorite phrases here is the low hanging fruit. Find that stuff that you can get started with, build momentum, build traction, and identify those things where you can see progress and say, these are our biggest priorities. These are the things that we can make concrete progress with, and go from there. A good starting point with that is an inventory of all the things. So a lot of times we think about asset management in terms of like what physical devices we have. But now we're in a world where we need to think about what places have access to our data. So we made a transition a few years ago to single sign-on, and we started off by just kind of when a vendor would request access to data for their app, we'd say, oh yeah, sure, here, have access. And we'd give them whatever default access they wanted. And we ended up going through and auditing what data they're asking for. And they're asking for ridiculous levels of information. In some cases, we might have a reading program, but it's asking for data down to the step parent's cell phone number. So really just trying to identify, what's out there, what's accessing your data, and what's it used for? Is it valid? It's a good place to start too.
Yeah, I would also add one more thing, David, real quickly. 3 words to use when you're having those discussions with your district administrators: student data privacy. I think when you showed that slide earlier about the different departments and what the concern was, and the HR in fiscal services weren't as concerned with privacy as the other sectors, I think that kind of hits the nail on the head. That's because they're dealing more with the employee side. When you start talking about kids and student data, everybody kind of perks up and sits up a little taller in the chair and is more willing to listen. At least that's been my experience. And I weave those words in there in every conversation as often as I can to just kind of hammer that point across.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And again, as I'm here live at the site conference in Sacramento, California, the California IT Education, one of my presentations, we really heavily dove into that topic around student data, the staff data, the privacies, the laws, the regulations, and that's a great point, Mike. So just a quick reminder for our audience, I'm going to get into one more question, and then we'll have Q&A. So remember, audience, all these great tidbits that are coming out there, any questions you have, please put them into the chat window, and we'll address those after we go through this next and final question. So Mike, Andy, the past year and a half, almost 2 years now, has really obviously changed our world tremendously. And back in May, the U.S. Department of Education released guidance around districts' abilities to use the ESSER and GEAR funds to improve cybersecurity. Did this impact your ability to improve your own district cybersecurity, and why did you decide to make those investments and improvements?
I'll go ahead and start. It really didn't impact me because I really never saw any of that money. That money went straight into the general fund to help with everything else associated with kids in the buildings and making sure we prepare to do all that stuff. Luckily, I've been able to do what I've been able to do with my funding that I currently get with my budgets, and I've been pretty successful about getting enhancements to my budget when I request them, when I need them. So in that regard, I've been lucky. But the ESSER funds and the CARES funds, I never really saw any of that money. That was all taken up at the higher level, distributed through other programs in our district, at least. And I'm sure I've heard that from other districts as well. It didn't really trickle down to IT like many had thought or had hoped. And that's at least my experience.
And I'll agree with Mike 100% there. That's exactly our experience too. The perk that comes out of it, though, is kind of, since it's freed up other areas, it's made, it's a fertile ground for suggestions. It's a good time,
Sure.
to make those suggestions. Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I know that's been a big topic everywhere I go in the United States. My team is, talks to folks all over the place every day, and different places it's been a mad rush. Yes, we got the money and we want to use it for these things, and other places like, no, we, like you said, Mike, we it never even got to us, and we're proceeding as business as usual. So thank you for sharing that. Again, reminder to everyone in the audience, if you have questions now, I'm going to kind of open the floor, with that. And while we're waiting for some questions to pop in, I'll remind everyone that today's webinar is recorded, will be sent out. I know there's been a couple questions about that, as well as then to learn more about the EdWeek Research Center report that we have been discussing, that was commissioned by Managed Methods. And then if you want to learn more about Managed Methods and what we're all about, and what Mike and Andy have been discussing and how they use our technology, feel free to visit managedmethods.com. We do offer a free trial of our platform so that you can see it in action. And maybe with that said, Mike, Andy, is there anything you want to share on that and your experience on how you began with us, and maybe share that with the audience?
Just a quick shout for me that it's one of those adoptions where implementation was insanely fast. The heavy lifting, there was no heavy lifting on our side. It was very quick, pretty much an API configuration, and we were up and running. We've even had a few opportunities where we've set up other environments in Managed Method as time has gone on with Zoom. And I had an Office 365 test environment, and both cases, adding both of those tools was a 5 to 10 minute addition. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. It was very quick.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. It stood up very quickly for us. David, your staff was very helpful in getting us stood up and kind of leading us through our initial implementation of it. Charles, another one of your staff members, is awesome with that regard, helping us understand what we were looking at there, because your dashboards are very, very complex and contain a lot of data, but it's very, very well organized. And once you get a handle on what you're looking at and understand what's being presented, it's a lot of very helpful information that you can use right away.
Outstanding, by the way, on the call, the shout out for another team member. Thank you so much. They are the unsung heroes. I get to be the one standing here and talking, but they are the true rock stars. Our customer success and our technical support teams and our engineering teams, and that's something, what, again, I'll share just for everyone before we take any questions if they pop up, is that the reason our technology is so easy to implement is it is 100% cloud native. It is a software as a service running in the cloud. There's no proxies, there's no extensions, there's no gateways, there's nothing you have to install on any end user devices or redirect traffic. It is, as Andy pointed out, done through APIs and a quick, simple integration into your Microsoft domain, your Google domain, your Zoom environment, and other environments that we support. So certainly you folks can check that out. There's been some postings put up into the chat for all the attendees. You can claim a free trial by clicking on the link that was put out there by Katie in the bit.ly. Mike also shared with the audience his email address if you want to contact Mike regarding CISA and MSISAC things that they've done. Thank you for sharing that, Mike. A quick question that came through. For schools with small IT departments, is there a good clearinghouse for contractual services to provide the highly technical support security network so that on-site teams can focus on integration and face-to-face support with their teachers, staff, students, etc.? Kind of a big question there.
Mike posted in the chat that he'll share the CISA and MSISAC resources. That's the place to start there, I believe. The amount of resources and the tools available and the services they offer, I'm still reeling. I found out about a year ago and have been kind of cycling through services, and it's like drinking from a fire hydrant, but it's all really good and really free.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And not only do they share links and resources, they're willing to sit down and talk with you too. They'll offer their services to you. So it's not just, written communication and documents that you have to wade through and figure it out on your own once you get it. They are willing to step up and have talks and discussions with you and your staff. So again, those are really good resources, readily available, free to K-12. Good place to get started. David, you had also mentioned K-12 6, relatively new in this space, but doing great work as well on behalf of K-12 school districts, specifically on behalf of K-12 school districts. So another good resource there too. One of our good friends over in Seattle Public Schools, April Murdoch, is on that committee that pulled that together. Very good work.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I know that Andy had posted into the chat, the K12cybersecure.com. Those two entities are related. So the K12 Cybersecurity Resource Center and the K12-6 are tied together, and absolutely great point. That Doug Levin and his organization and all those people, absolutely, they've done some great work. And I think, one more shout out that I'll put out there, and Andy, I know you agree, Mike, you agree, because that's how we came together. COSN and your regional chapters and your regional organizations, like I'm here today at the California, information or IT and education, and Mike, up in your world, there's the ACPNW, and Andy, you got TITA out there, and COSN at a national layer. We are proud national sponsors of COSN. We get involved on a national level, and we're proud to be a part of all of the regional organizations. And there's so many great resources out there amongst your peers. If you're not involved in these in your regional where you are, if you're somewhere and you're not sure, contact me here at Managed Methods. I can get you in touch with any one of the regional chapters. If you happen to be in Tennessee or in Washington or the Pacific Northwest, wherever, obviously Andy and Mike, great resources as well for their regional chapters. But go check it out, and definitely look at all those resources. I think first off, thank you both for joining us today and taking time out. You've been great friends to Managed Methods, and we appreciate again the shout outs to our team members. Let's summarize. It's a very important topic. We need to have more discussions around this. It's first and foremost, we got to protect our schools. We got to protect our kiddos. We are unfortunately, in the crosshairs now, moving into the top 5 consistently over the past few years. The education community really needs to now step up and focus. I know that education technology for classrooms is vitally important, but if people are compromised when they use that technology, or they're exposed, or there's threats, we have to, make sure we cover that. So today we talked about the findings from this survey. For all of our audience, you want to learn more about it, go to managedmethods.com. If you want to get a copy of the survey that we commissioned through EdWeek Research Center, again, that's the press release went out earlier this week, and you can get that information from visiting our website. As you see now up on the screen, if you'd like to experience what Andy and Mike already know about Managed Methods and see how we fit in to that multi-layered approach that we've talked about and can help address some of those points and those gaps that the survey talked about, please take advantage of the free trial. And this is a great time of year. We have a lot of people signing up right now because you can catch end of semester activity before the holidays, and then catch what happens when people are connecting remotely during the holidays. So we greatly appreciate it. I want to say thank you, Andy. Thank you, Mike. It's been great to spend this time with you. And to our audience members, thank you for joining us today here at this webinar, Beyond the Content Filter, talking about what we do out here in the environment and what are some of the problems we're trying to address for cybersecurity, cyber safety, compliance, data protection itself. So closing thoughts and comments. Andy, I'll hit you first.
Just appreciate being a part of this. And, I never want to do anything that is for a sales pitch. So I'm not here to sell Managed Methods on your behalf, but it's a product that we use and we believe in, and that's given us, visibility. We talk all the time in our department here about, you got to see what's broken to fix it. And it gives us that chance to take a deeper look.
Thanks, Andy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again, David, for the invite and the opportunity to share it. I would just leave you with parting words that please do your due diligence. I know it's a long, tough road, especially for smaller districts, those that don't have a lot of staff, a lot of budget, but it's definitely a need. And make sure that you do your due diligence to make sure that you're doing everything you can to protect you and your staff and your students in your district from the things that are out there. It's not a matter of if, in my mind, it's a matter of when.
Well said. Well said, both of you. Mike, Andy, thank you so much for your time today. To all of our audience members, thank you so much. And again, everyone, appreciate your time today. It takes a village. We're all in this together. Yep. And it's an important topic to talk about. So I wish you all well. Be healthy, be safe. Enjoy the rest of your day. Until next time. Thank you.